Serious. What the most disturbing or creepy thing that you've ever witnessed in real life? Part 2. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. I grew up in rural western Kentucky. From age 8 until I graduated high school, my MOMD, dad, younger brother, and I lived way out in the woods. Essentially, for thousands and thousands of acres, it was just us and 3 other families that owned the land. This area was along the Cumberland River. Every year I lived there, a few days before Halloween, the barely paved county road that allowed us and the other families get to our homes would become a path for a large caravan of bikers. Real bikers. Sometimes as many as 40 or 50. They always waved, never menaced us, just drove by. For a couple years we had no idea why they came down. My parents eventually asked the man who once owned all the property in the area who they were. I don't know what he told them, but they told me, I'm around 11 or so at this point, that I was to leave them alone. They were bad people and referred to them as devil worshippers, and they sacrificed babies. Probably just a gang that got fucked up in the woods, but it still scared me. Anyway, one day my dad and I went out to ride our 4-wheelers on miles and miles of trails. After an hour or two my dad and I stop so he can have a few beers, alcoholic. And while we are stopped, we can see maybe 500 or 600 yards down in a sort of valley, and we notice where these devil worshippers were camped out. Make a mental note, and go on with our day. A few days later we see the bikes leaving for the year and dad and I head back to their camp. Walking around we find beer cans, and other signs of camp, no biggie. We go to the far end of camp and there's a huge fire pit encircled by stones, and about 10 feet in front of that are 4 posts in the ground that look like maybe they held a platform or something. Hear dad shout, "Shit," and look over towards the direction of his gaze. Some sort of deer skull was hanging from a tree. Dad says we gotta go. On our way back to our ATVs, dad notices something else around the fire pit ashes. It was a pacifier. Probably just normal bikers and their families hanging out and having fun, but the combo of the skull and pacifier after being told they were devil worshippers who killed babies creeped me out for several years. When I was a senior in high school, I walked out to my car and waited for my little sister to get there to head home. While I was sitting there listening to music, I saw this car slowly drive by. The driver was a middle-aged man that didn't have a shirt on, and I could tell by the way his shoulder was moving. His right arm was moving up and down in a masturbatorial fashion. As soon as my sister got to the car I went home and immediately told my mom what I saw, and we called the school to report it. They went over the surveillance cameras and saw a car fitting the description I have had pulled into the parking lot, circled around a couple times, then left. So that's the creepiest, most disturbing thing I've ever seen. TLDR. When I was in high school, I saw a naked man driving around the school parking lot masturbating. Potentially missed the window of opportunity for this, but oh well. This is one of my favorite stories. So I have a memory from when I was younger, about 4, when this old woman came to live with us. She was my great aunt, but at the time I didn't really understand all those levels of extended family, so I just thought she was some woman. I called her the Candy Lady, and you'll see why. She was staying in my mom's sewing room, which I know I thought was odd, because it had no bed, and she didn't have a suitcase or anything, which I also thought was odd, but being 4-ish I really had no way of articulating this. I just went with the punches, man. But this lady was really nice and wanted to talk to me all the time. Whenever I was in the room she would ask me questions about preschool, my dog, my cats, my room, my friends I played with down the street, even the injured birds we found and rehabilitated, which had just happened, so I was very excited that she knew this. She always carried this black fur coat with her and it had candy in the pockets, and she would give me pieces. It was a very normal visit, from what I remember. Like I said, I was 4, so it's relatively hazy, but I remember moments that pop out, like the questions, and the coat, and how she would just sit quietly with my mom in the kitchen while I played. After about 2 weeks, she left. One day I came home from school and realized she was no longer there, and life carried on as usual. Fast forward to my 13th birthday. I'm out for dinner with my mom and I mentioned that time that great Aunt Flora stayed with us. I now knew her name and face from photos and stories, but I knew she had long since died and I had never seen her again after that one time. So I brought up her visit and my mom said, "No, great Aunt Flora never stayed with us and you never even got to meet her before she died." So I start thinking maybe I have the name wrong. We have a big family as is and I don't know all of my grandparents' many siblings. So I say, "Oh, maybe not her. I'm thinking of the one who ran the candy shop in that small town. The one you grew up with." And she says that yes, I'm thinking of Aunt Flora. And I tell her I'm sure she stayed with us. Then, my mom gets a weird look on her face. She goes all quiet and listens to me recounting my memories, before she tells me her version. Right before the visit, my mom went on a trip to the hometown of my great-aunt Flora because she was sick with the flu and needed help around the house and her candy shop. My mom was extremely close to her growing up and wanted Flora to meet her first baby, me. Flora assured her she would, no matter what. My mom came back home, and about a week later Flora came down with pneumonia and died. My mom said shortly after the funeral, which only my mom attended because I was young and my dad worked a lot, I started talking with an imaginary friend, or that's what she thought, except it was weird because I could usually only focus on imaginary friends for a few days before I grew bored of them, and this one was sticking around, and I usually gave them voices and talked for them. This one was like I was just taking part in one side of the conversation. When asked, I told her I was talking to the candy lady, or, as my mom now fervently believes, the ghost of my great-aunt Flora, staying true to her word and meeting her youngest grandniece. The black coat, I also found out, was the one my mother had been left in Flora's will, and when she got it, she found candy in the pocket. TLDR. I vividly remember my great-aunt coming to stay with us when I was young, but it turns out it was just her ghost meeting me before flitting off to the afterlife with a dope coat and some candy NBD. I drove a friend who was doing research on his family tree to an old cemetery where his family had a private mausoleum, granite, with bronze doors, to check out who was entombed within. As once noted here some time ago, those bronze doors hadn't been opened in decades. But when the caretaker got them unlocked with his large skeleton key, we discovered that vandals had removed protective iron bars and smashed a stained glass window on the back side of the mausoleum. It backed up against other structures and was out of sight. It was disturbing and painfully sad to see that those crooks had broken the seals on the above-ground crypts and removed rings and other items entombed with his deceased family members. I am a fourth-year medical student. Last year, during my third-year rotation, an old woman was brought into the I was told by EMS she had suffered a stroke. She was brought via EMS to the trauma room. When I entered the room she was on her side, turned towards me. One nurse was putting a catheter in her, one was getting blood from her arm and another was taking her temperature rectally. The patient was violently shaking and she just had this look of sheer terror on her face. She looked right at me in a way I have never had anyone look at me. One side of her face and body were paralyzed. She tried to talk but her words came out only as slurs. At some point, her daughter came into the room and they locked eyes and both started crying. During all this, I held the patient still while the nurses worked on her, and at some point, she held my hand and clutched it in terror. I looked down at her legs at one point and they were as white as snow. One of her legs was bruised deeply, and we learned that when she had the stroke, she had fallen and broken her leg. She was not discovered for at least 5 hours after the stroke had occurred. She had laid and suffered for hours, paralyzed and in pain. When I left the hospital she was alive, but I was told she had died the next day. Needless to say, I was very upset by the whole experience. I remember leaving the after my shift was over and just breaking down and crying. God bless EMS and doctors, nurses and techs. Probably an unexpected answer to this question, as it was the most painful thing I've experienced, but disturbing nonetheless. I came home one afternoon to find my dog had drowned in my pool. I was in high school at the time, with my parents at work. Immediately I go to the backyard to bring my dog inside. For those of you who have pets, it's already a sinking feeling when there's no response to you calling out their name. I remember walking past the pool. It had not even approached my mind to look there as he was a good swimmer, and we had taught him where the steps were in the pool to get out, and yet in the corner of my eye I saw something white and brown in there. Having to jump in there, pick up his still body, everything that followed felt like a nightmare. I loved my dog, he was a part of the family. It felt so cruel that he had to go like that. So yes, more sad than creepy, but was it disturbing to see my dog like that? Think about how panicked his last moments were. Absolutely. About a year ago, my dad passed away from terminal cancer. My parents purchased a lazy boy for my dad so he could rest comfortably sitting upwards. After his passing, we decided to list it online and sell it. My, then, 3-year-old daughter approached the man who got out of the car to buy it, thinking it was her deceased grandfather. Both were large men. When she walked up to him with her arms out, his eyes lit up in a very strange way. It was not joyous, it was sexual. I called my daughter over to me, handed her off to my husband. Buyer seems annoyed, decides he's not buying it and leaves. About a year later, my daughter and I are in a grocery store. I see the same man looking at my daughter the same way like he desired her. I grabbed my kid, he snapped his eyes up at me angrily like I had just interrupted him and stomps off. That was the first time I have ever seen a grown man stare at a little girl like she was a piece of meat. And it scared the shit out of me. There are some very evil people in this world, folks. Hang on to your kids. I was returning home on my scooter, more of a half bike than scooter, and I saw a single person on the road before the turn home. The guy was bald, had some bag, wore a jacket and other normal things. He looked drunk, with a dead look in his eyes. He stumbled from left to right and kept staring at me. I got creeped out and went faster. As I passed, I saw him turn around. Silence. Nearly at the turn, I turned around. He was still there. He didn't move, but he was still there, staring at me. Without moving an inch. Back when I was a kid, family was on a road trip and we decided to stay a night at the closest motel we could find. We were all pretty tired. And we settled on a cheaper site. It was just to sleep the night and we were to be back on the road, so no big deal, right? My mom and dad rented a separate room for my brother and me, while he and my mom and sister went to another room. Our rooms were booked separate, my brother and I upstairs and they were downstairs. Upon entering the room, we knew we were going to get what we paid for. It was rather cheap, the room isn't exactly fully illuminated with the lights on, and the bathroom was dirty. The place needed to be repainted at the very least. But let's just get to the story. It was past dark at this point, so my brother and I just brushed and went straight to bed. I remember drifting off to sleep with my CD player playing some tunes. I don't remember how long it was, but my brother never slept. He woke me up shortly with a nudge. "Brother. Hey, do you hear that?" I take off my headphones. I'm not sure what he's talking about. Being half asleep, I thought I misheard him. Me. "What? Brother. Do you hear that?" I look my brother in the eye. He looks scared. I'm not sure what's going on. Oh, I hear footsteps. Right at the edge of the bed. It sounds as if someone's pacing back and forth. We pull the sheets over our heads. "Brother. Dude, I think someone's there." We were seriously shook at this point and terrified to say the least. "Brother. Go get the lights." Me. "No, you do it." "Brother. I'm scared. I can't move." Me. "Let's do it together." As I said that, I slowly lowered the covers from our heads. All we saw was a dark room. I began to scan the room, left to right, and then right to left. Somehow, I had this great idea to lock eyes into the mirror across the room. And that's when I saw it. A black figure, or shadow, or whatever it was, possibly looking back at me. It didn't even have a face. I could make out a hat and the upper half of the torso. I shouted, "What the hell?" and went back under the sheets. My brother freaked at this point and we stayed under the sheets for the rest of the night. Anyway, without making the story too long, we were paralyzed from fear. We couldn't even get up to reach our cell phones, which were charging on the desk across the room. All we could do was to wait out the night. We continued to hear faint footsteps, some knocks on our bed frame, and even the sink turned on and off once throughout the night. We assumed this was our neighboring travelers. Right when morning came and the morning rays shot through our windows, we were able to get up and GTFO out of there. We examined the bathroom, the sink is dry. And before we left, we found out the room besides us was vacant and undergoing cleaning. I've been terrified of mirrors ever since and can't be around one for too long. Especially at night. TL. Drive. Saw black figure in the mirror, now terrified of mirrors. I have a lot more stories, but this one stuck with me the most. I was a cashier at a local grocery and I saw an unkempt old man with a scraggly gray, dirty beard. He came to my line pushing his cart swiftly and avoiding eye contact. From behind him came 2 or 3 young girls dressed in dirty Amish-looking clothes. Like they lived in the prairie. I live in a city with no Amish and no farms nearby. My mind tried to justify it, thinking maybe they were just passing through. I tried to say, "Are you okay?" with my eyes to one of the girls. She just looked at me confused. I kept my eyes on her as she bagged the groceries. They looked uncomfortable and in my heart I knew something was wrong. I glared at the guy and watched their every move as they left, trying to find any sign of distress. Our registers were right in front of large windows that looked over the parking lot. The next person in line came through with their groceries and I couldn't stop looking out into the parking lot. I saw them load their things in a truck and leave. I wanted so badly to see one little sign that would affirm my unease towards the whole thing and prompt me to call the police. It was the most chilling thing I have ever seen, and I felt helpless. I was fairly young and naive. I told my parents about it when I went home, and my dad said I should have called someone. I tried to talk to my coworkers to see if they noticed it and if they had the same feeling I had, but they were all in their own little worlds. All they could do was shrug and say, "There's a lot of weird people in the world." Although I never really forgot about it, I just let it go and tried to shake it off. Well, last year, this story came up on the news and I saw the face of this man once again. I nearly cried. I could have saved these girls 4 years earlier. Here is the article. There are definitely scarier stories out there, but this one has really stuck with me and probably inflicted some trauma to boot. Apologies if it turns out a bit long. I lived at the bottom of a cul-de-sac which was situated on a very, very steep hill. During the time of this story, I had just turned 14 and was babysitting my neighbor's 3 kids while they went on a date night. Another neighbor, also with 3 kids, was watching hers play with the children I was watching. After a while, she said she was going up to check on dinner and asked me to keep an eye on her kids as well. Not liking confrontation, I agreed. 6 rowdy kids, however, is a bit much for a single 14-year-old girl. When the youngest, who I will call Jason, went up to his house, I was super relieved. As he was maybe 3 years old, his 8-year-old sister walked him up. The sister came back down, so now I only had 5 kids, all at least 6 or older. I'm not sure how much time passed, but the mother of the other kids never came back down. Jason did, however. Apparently he wandered back out of the house at the very top of the hill and into the garage, where they kept their outdoor toys. He found one of those plastic cars, the one with pedals but also a handle so an adult can push the toy. Jason had no shoes on, no shirt, no helmet, and was flying down the hill at an alarming speed. When I copped to the fact that the screaming I was hearing was out of terror and not fun from the other kids, I looked up and saw Jason rocketing at me on the scooter car thing. A different neighbor would swear that he was going at least 30 miles per hour, but I honestly don't remember. It was like time slowed down for me. When he reached me, he was trying to slow himself down on the hard pavement by putting his feet down. Naturally, this tore his poor feet up. I reached out to grab him, but I probably didn't quite weigh 100 pounds at the time. I couldn't stop the toy. Jason hit a car parked on the street headfirst. I heard a sick crack, a squeal, and then silence. Adrenaline does wacky things because apparently I stared screaming, but I don't remember that. I also dislocated my shoulder from trying to grab the car and being jerked after it, but I didn't notice that, either. All I knew was that I had to get Jason to his mother, who still hadn't come down. So with one functioning arm, I scooped him up and moved uphill as quickly as I could. It was not a small hill, but at least Jason was crying again, so he was at least conscious. When I got us all up to his house, all of the other children were inside. His mother was drunk. I could smell it on her. By this point, Jason and I were absolutely covered in blood, and I am so stunned all I can say through my own tears as Jason hit the car. His mother somehow got him to the hospital, where he had to stay for a while. His condition was touch and go for a while because it turned out to be a major head and neck injury. The police came, and I had to give a statement to them while still covered in blood and reeling from emotional shock. One of the officers was able to pop my shoulder back in, I think. I'm not really sure what happened to the family after that, but the mother and father divorced and both moved away shortly after that. I was washing blood out of my hair for literal days. TLDR version. Irresponsible parent leaves their small child unattended and I have to deal with the terrible accident that results from that. Also, sorry for typos. I shook a bit while typing it all up on my phone. Managed to witness multiple dead and mutilated bodies during my childhood. 1. Guy on a motorbike crashed and hit his head on the corner of a stone wall, splitting his head wide open. Ironically, the stone wall wore part of a cemetery. 2. Guy on a motorbike took a turn too fast, fell off the bike, and slid all the way on the street before hitting a stone pillar. You could see the trail of skid blood leading up to the pillar and ultimately, his head. 3. Guy was shot dead in my apartment complex. Shooting had just recently occurred and the body wasn't covered yet. Turns out that this guy was an undercover cop and he was absolutely riddled with holes. Saw this while riding home from church service with my mom. 4. Me and my friend come across a naked dead shot body in the snow. No blood trail, so was likely shot right there, buck naked, in the cold. We just noted it, continued home without much surprise, and just called the police when we got there. We were calloused to crime and death at this point in our lives. A schizophrenic episode. I witnessed a few while I worked in a psychiatric home for kids, but one I'll never forget was of course late at night and after a really long, shitty day of getting my ass kicked. I had the individual ready for bed and tucked the individual in bed after a short story. We had to stay sitting in the hallway to keep sight and sound on all individuals. Hallway was basically completely dark. I thought that our awful day was behind us and was looking forward to going home in 2 hours. About 5 minutes into thinking this, I hear the individual get out of bed. I can see their silhouette in front of the window of the bedroom. I whisper, "It's time for bed. Name." Then I heard a growl and scratching against the window. Ah fuck nah, here we go. I wasn't one to ever ask for help, as sometimes it escalates behaviors, so I plan ignore. Individual gets back on bed and I can see that they're sitting with their legs crossed and looking straight up with mouth open. Shit. I start kind of freaking out, some crazy shit about to happen. It was completely silent and then the individual starts screaming, "Thehyre here." Over and over, the loudest, most ear-piercing scream I've ever heard in my life. My manager comes running to me and I can't move, I am terrified. We nod at each other and mouth, "Fuck." We both look into the bedroom. The individual snaps her head at us and continues screaming this while staring at us with this tormented look. I tell the individual that they are safe and it will be okay. I fucked up apparently because the individual came charging at me and attacked us both. I will never forget that scream and how demented it sounded. After being completely terrified, my heart broke for this individual. I can't imagine the terror of living with a mental illness like that, the never-ending fear. Closing parenthesis colon dot. About 10 years ago I was working as a private investigator. It sounds cool, but it's actually not. You spend about 3 to 5 hours each day driving to your cases, stake them out in a blazing hot car with the engine off for 8 hours and then spend 1 to 3 hours in a hotel room writing up your reports before finally getting some sleep and doing it all over again. I did this job for about a year after completing my training to be a medic in the Army Reserves. I was young at the time, so the idea of making $50,000 a year and traveling all over the country while living out of a suitcase seemed appealing to 19-year-old me. As I said above, you spend a lot of time driving in areas you are not necessarily familiar with. On one of these late nights I found myself driving on a twisting mountain road just outside of Taos, NM. The area was heavily wooded with narrow roads that curved sharply without a lot of places to turn off since you were driving up and around mountains. In the middle of the night, as I maneuvered my rental vehicle through a curve, I saw a woman stumbling along the side of the road carrying a small child. The sight caught me off guard and sent a shiver down my spine. It was so unexpected and so out of place. There were no houses or businesses around me and it was around 2 a.m. and pitch black. This unnerved me, but what sent the shiver down my spine was the way she moved. She lurched along with what I can only describe as a shuffle, straight out of a George Romero zombie flick. And she didn't look up or acknowledge me as I drove by. She just stared aimlessly at the road in front of her. You have to remember, I was a 19-year-old that was fresh out of a year of extensive Army training. I was in peak physical shape and I thought I was Billy Badass at the time. I had spent a month working in a trauma center as part of my training, so I didn't and still don't get freaked out by these things, but this scared me. I drove on for a minute or two thinking about what I saw. Who was she? What was she doing out here at this time of night? How did she get here? The more rational part of my brain took over from my lizard brain and I came to a horrifying realization. I had been driving for about 1.5 miles past her and I hadn't seen any homes or businesses. Nor had I come across any places to turn off since I had seen her. And it had been about 10 miles since I had come across a place to turn before I saw her. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. I realized that she had to be hurt or in trouble. Perhaps she had been in a car accident and was in shock? What if the child she was carrying was hurt? I was a medic. I had trained for a year to help people. Sure, I was scared and unnerved, but how would I feel if I found out later they died of exposure on that mountain and I was too much of a coward to go back and help? Wouldn't I also be scared the first time I saw combat when my friends were depending on me? I had to man up and turn around. And as soon as it was safe, I did. I drove back to where I had seen her, half relieved and half horrified when I didn't find her. I traced the road 6 times. Where could she have gone? There was only a small area on the side of the road and guardrails for miles. I drove and turned around and drove and turned around and drove and turned around. I was obsessed with finding her or finding what had happened. Part of it was out of concern for her and her child. Part of it was about proving to myself that I would do the right thing with my training even when I was scared shitless. After a while, however, it became about me proving to myself that I wasn't fucking insane. I spent hours looking for her. Eventually I stopped my car and started walking along the road looking for any signs of her or any disturbances on the mountain to indicate a vehicle had crashed off the road and down the mountain. I walked that entire 3-mile stretch of road in pitch black with a flashlight, at times yelling like a madman, listening to every twig and echo with bated breath. I didn't even care about my deadline or my next case. I was so sure of what I saw that I was all in. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't seeing things. I wasn't overly tired. I saw her stumbling down that road, there is no doubt in my mind. The image is etched in my memory. But there was nothing. Even when the sun came up and I drove that stretch of road another half-dozen times, there was nothing. And there were no ways for me to explain it away even after countless sleepless nights in the 10 years since devoted to it. I don't believe in ghosts. I see the BS documentaries and laugh away their evidence and stupid orbs like the rest of you do, but I also don't know where the hell the stumbling woman and her child came from or where they went. So on the off chance you were stumbling down a windy road in Taos, NM about 10 years ago with a toddler in your arms, please tell me what the hell happened, where you came from, where you went, and that you are both okay. I've been puzzled by it for a decade now. Driving home on a country road at night. The 2 cars in front of me stop right on the road and the driver of the first goes to each car asking for a phone. This was 15 years ago, so not everyone had one. I had no clue what was going on, but more and more vehicles were stopping, even in the other direction. Finally, a truck pulled into the field opposite me and turned with its lights shining directly into my car. Laying in the lane right next to me was a body silhouetted by the headlights. Turns out it was a guy riding his bike to work. The guy that hit him drove off thinking he had hit a deer. I heard the driver was really upset with himself, but I don't know for sure. It was the only time I had seen a dead body outside of a funeral. I was a freshman at UW-Madison in 1989, living in one of the dorms in the southeast area of campus, Celery Hall. One evening, we were watching TV in the lounge on 2nd floor, when we heard what sounded like a piece of furniture hitting first the building, then the ground. I was closest to the windows, so I got up to look to see what someone threw out of a window. I will never forget what I saw. A student, on LSD, had stripped, and then either fallen or had jumped out of his 7th floor room. The first floor of the building juts out from the tower part, and the first sound we heard was him landing on his back on the edge of the building, followed by his impact with the ground. His impact with the edge of the building had scraped the flesh up his back from just above his hips to near his shoulders. You could clearly see his spine and ribs and the horrible, horrible redness of the inside of our bodies. There were emergency responders there within minutes. Someone saw him falling, but it took a terribly long time for them to cover him up. It's been nearly 30 years, but the scene is as clear in my mind today as it was that night. His name was Joe Sickerman. His father, Al, was a writer for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Back when I was doing a lot of work on film sets, I got contracted to serve on an independent feature being shot in a town called Orinda. It was a small, upper-middle-class community with such landmarks as a 1940s movie theater, an artisanal cupcake shop, and a smattering of semi-expensive restaurants, all of which combined to create a suburban setting that was completely devoid of anything normally thought of as eerie or disturbing. In fact, the most remarkable thing I saw for the vast majority of the shoot was the hubbub that was caused when a local homeless man decided to completely disrobe before going shopping at a drugstore. That changed when the final day of filming rolled around. I'd arrived in Orinda at about 4 in the morning, ready to unload and set up all of the equipment that would be needed for the scheduled scenes. Unfortunately, the equipment truck had yet to put in an appearance, meaning that I was forced to stand around until it pulled up. Despite it being the middle of summer, the air was uncommonly cold, and I had to keep moving in order to stave off the nibbling numbness that was working its way through my jacket. I took to walking in tight circles, swinging my arms and bringing my knees almost all the way up to my chest, which probably made me look like I was rehearsing for some sort of bird-themed ballet. There was nobody else around to see me, though, so I just kept right at it. Until I happened to glance across the street, where I spotted a woman who had seemingly appeared from out of thin air. If I told you to imagine a modern-day witch, you wouldn't be far off from picturing this individual's appearance. She was clad in layers upon layers of too large clothing, and while she had the appearance of being someone who lived on the street, her impeccably clean white hair and gaudy jewelry suggested otherwise. She stared at me from about 10 meters away, and although I couldn't quite make out her facial expression, I somehow got the idea that she was scowling with disapproval. Since I'd been trying to keep warm by way of interpretive dance, I assumed that I'd given my one-person audience the impression that I was under the influence of some illicit substance or another, and as a means of, hopefully, proving otherwise, I put on a big smile and waved. The woman responded by strutting toward me at a startlingly fast pace. Honestly, that situation had no right to be as frightening as it was. This woman was maybe 5 feet tall, and although her figure was obscured by the many garments that she had on, I couldn't imagine her weighing more than 100 pounds. Even so, as the distance between us closed, I felt an alarming compulsion to sprint in the opposite direction. That urge took too long to make its way to my feet, though, and within seconds, the crone was directly in front of me. "What are you supposed to tell me?" she demanded. The woman's voice, which was surprisingly smooth and melodic, if chillingly harsh, was colored by an accent that I'd never encountered before, nor heard since. It seemed vaguely South American, but with some almost Russian elements, and it somehow had the quality of being both completely understandable and yet wholly alien at the same time. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I'm not sure what you're asking." The same question was repeated. "What are you supposed to tell me?" Several thoughts went through my mind. As I said, I was in the area because of a film shoot, and while the woman in front of me didn't look like one of our cast, nor had I ever encountered an actor who arrived before the crew, I couldn't imagine anything else about which I might inform her. The idea that she was insane vanished almost as soon as it came up, given that the sharp clarity behind the woman's gaze was far too focused and intent. Perhaps, I briefly considered, she was a foreign tourist who had never encountered the pre-dawn desertedness of a small American town. But her advanced years and perfect English seemed to suggest otherwise. "I'm sorry," I said again, "I really don't know how to answer that." I paused for a moment, and the woman didn't respond. "Is there something that you're expecting me to tell you?" For a few tense seconds, the woman glared up at me. Then, slowly enough that I almost didn't notice the shift, her frown gave way to an expression of disappointed sympathy. "You don't know yet." She exhaled through her nose and shook her head. "Maybe you will never know." "Could you explain it to me?" I asked. I didn't even really know what I was requesting, but I hoped that the answer would clear up my increasing confusion. Once again, the woman shook her head. "If you cannot see, I cannot help you." It was an innocuous enough statement, but I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Without saying another word to me, the woman turned and walked back the way she had come, eventually disappearing around a corner. Even though I kept listening for the sound of her jangling jewelry or the rustle of her clothes, the street stayed silent. I went back to my dance not long after that, but the chill stayed with me the entire day. TLDR. An old woman asked me a question that I couldn't answer, but I still feel like I got it wrong. Mine is pretty tame compared to a lot of the others here, but here goes. My parents had Shetland sheepdogs, Shelties, since we were kids. Just about the time I went off to college, they got another one from a breeder who showed these dogs, and named her Sophie. This Sheltie was way bigger than they are supposed to be, almost like small collie, but she was the best dog we had before or since. I hate the saying, old soul, but that is what she was like. Anyway, once my brother and I were out of the house, she was really my parents' child. She had some health problems as she grew older, including losing eyesight and hearing, etc., but she was always the sweetest thing. Anyway, my son was born in April and we live a considerable ways from my parents, so the first time we could get up to see them was in the fall, around Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, their dog passed away in September of that year, when my son was only 5 months old, so he never got to meet her. Fast forward to when he was 3, we went to my folks' house for Christmas. One day almost at the end of our 2-week trip, my son overhears us talking about the dog. He asks me, "Who is Sophie?" I tell him it used to be his grandparents' dog, and show him a picture that they have on the wall of her. He looks at the picture and says matter-of-factly, "Oh, the ghost dog," and then just walks away. I was stunned and did not know what to say. Told my wife and she was pretty creeped out. He's older now and doesn't remember saying it, but it sure was weird at the time. I go to Download Festival pretty much every year, but this year, strolling through the stalls at the village, come across a young woman lying face down sort of in one of the stall tents with a man and a bottle of water next to her. I asked if she was okay, and he said he didn't know her. He runs the stall and she stumbled in and collapsed. Sent my boyfriend to find a medic and I sat down and put her head in my lap and tried to get any information out of her. Found out her name and campsite pretty quickly, but she didn't know whereabouts her tent was. Then what I thought she said, slurring very badly, was that she'd been left by all her friends. I asked her what she had taken, since she was very obviously on something, and she said she didn't know. Her boyfriend gave her a few pills and made her take them, and said he was taking some too. I asked where he was and she repeated what she'd said earlier, only I understood this time. Her boyfriend had given her pills and then when she didn't want to go back to the tent, he dumped her on the floor and just left her there. She downed about 2 liters of water just while I was there. I'm so glad the stall worker kept her safe, even if he didn't know what to do, as they had no way to contact medics or security. When boyfriend came back with the medics, I went with her as far as I could and said goodbye. She was put in that position by someone she trusted and I burst into tears afterwards, which I'm putting down to my period and not cause I'm soppy. Owner of the stall told us we were the only ones who had asked if she was okay, let alone tried to help. Other people were watching and laughing. People can be assholes when they're part of a crowd. Went with a family member one time for him to show me his remote-controlled airplane. Neither of us had any land or wide openings by us to really use, so he took us to a big thing of land that he said was his buddy's father's land. Didn't think anything of it, and after a bit the buddy came by and he was just a regular guy. Seemed a little slow and country-ish, but other than that there was nothing really odd about him. Shortly after the buddy arrived, someone came out of a house close by and my family member just says, "Don't say anything," in a really low voice. I'm immediately confused, and figure maybe it's something involving the land or it's the buddy's father and there's just something off about him. The guy gets closer and he's an older guy, maybe late 60s, but he was very healthy looking and had great posture compared to most I would see in that age range. He's wearing a completely black cowboy hat and a very tight-fitting leisure suit. Not sure if this is the right name of it, but it wasn't really a suit but similar in design. Anyways, when he came out, I realized I never even needed to be told to not say anything because the dude just had an insanely scary presence. He looked scary as shit and there wasn't a hint of any kind of emotion or facial expression on his face. He came and stood by the 3 of us and his son, the buddy, said a few things to him and he did nothing but nod his head. After a couple minutes he walked away and eventually the buddy left as well. My family member immediately said the guy was the leader of some kind of satanic-like church or cult or something, and this land has his church on it. He ended up showing it to me when we were leaving. Just sort of looked like a small white building, but it had what looked somewhat like upside-down red crosses about every 3 feet along the outside walls. It's not exactly a creepy thing I had seen, but more of a creepy-ass encounter I will never forget. It's hard to put into words how the guy getting within 10 feet of us just made such a huge impression that was instantly felt. I've seen the building once or twice since then and I don't think it's used for the same thing anymore, as the crosses are gone and a lot of the trees and wooded area around it has been removed, so it's not so hidden, which makes me think it's something different now. Down the street from my house there was a home with a swing set kinda close to the road. My dad is kind of a landscaping snob, you could say, and one morning on the way to school he commented on how it looked tacky in the yard because it was in front of the house and too close to the road. So it just kinda always stood out to me after that. Every time we passed it I'd look at the house. Came to notice there was a little blonde boy that lived there out there playing on the swing set after school some days. He looked either 8 or 9. One morning on the way to school an ambulance had just pulled in the driveway. As we passed by, what I'm assuming was the boy's father came bursting through the front door running towards the ambulance with a blonde boy in his arms just kinda flapping. You could tell by the way the body just flopped as he ran, the boy was dead. It was only a few seconds because we were driving by the scene, but it felt like a lifetime. Eventually the swing set was removed from the yard. My wife, GF at the time, and I were driving down our street. We pass an alley, we pass it every day, and see a child of about 2 years old just in diapers. Right away we parked the car and walked to the child calmly so as not to frighten him away. We looked around waiting for an adult to maybe come out of one of the backyards. We were so confused. My wife starts asking the child questions while staying a few feet away. It's sad because we did not want to touch the child in a way and be accused of being inappropriate, so we attempted no physical contact. Anyways, the child might have noticed the tone in my wife's voice and he started panicking. She was just asking him where his parents were and where he lived. He started walking down the alley and we just followed. I had my phone in my hand ready to call the police when the child led us to an open gate. At this point, we are still staying a few feet away from him. He goes into the back door of a duplex and goes up 2 flights of stairs. I am still holding my phone and I didn't call 911 yet, because we thought maybe this was his home. He stops at a door on the 2nd floor and we knock. A woman opens the door and we ask if this was her child. The child was of Middle Eastern descent and so was the woman. She starts panicking and saying things like, "OMG, how did you get out?" and thank us. We told her we found him down the alley and we followed him there. She picked him up and kissed him, etc. We were so relieved, but at the same time pissed that a child could have gotten kidnapped or seriously hurt because they weren't being watched properly. We were pretty disturbed, but luckily we came along. A few minutes more or less, we would not have seen that kid standing there in that alley. Crazy. I didn't realize at the time because I was 3, but my family and I traveled to Cambodia the year it opened to tourism again. Once we were about to visit a temple and in front of it there was a bunch of people. In this group there was this old woman, she was sitting, and I realized that she was sitting because she couldn't stand. Both her feet and also her hands had been cut off. It didn't scare me or anything because the way the skin had grown back onto the bones looked like a cartoon, like Tom and Jerry, roasted chicken, so I smiled.